When it comes to raising and disciplining children, it seems there are as many opinions and so-called parenting experts as there are children. Despite all the warnings and criticism, 4 out of 5 parents still spank their kids, while most so-called experts preach that spanking is always harmful, that the negative consequences of disciplining a child outweigh any behavioral benefits. Who's right? How do we separate fact from fiction when it comes to successful and fruitful child raising? We'll discuss that today on today's episode of Ask Dr. Walt.
Today, our health includes our mind, our body, and our spirit. Separating medical facts from fiction is the key that leads to wise decisions about our health and well-being. Unpacking the latest research is vital. Doing what works helps us live our best lives today. How can we live longer? How can we live healthier? Let's ask Dr. Walt on Liftable TV.
Hi everyone, I'm family physician Dr. Walt Larimore, and I'm happy you're joining me today for what I hope will be a useful discussion for those who love children, especially those who are or will be parents. I mean, parents are faced with so many questions. Do I discipline my child or not? Should I be my child's friend or coach? Do I spank our child or not? These are some of the most commonly asked parenting questions, especially for young or new parents. But the topic of disciplining a child is emotionally charged and often sparks controversy. And the problem is, there's not an easy answer. But to help us begin to navigate these controversies is Den Trumbull, MD, who received his bachelor's degree from the University of Florida, his medical degree from the University of Miami School of Medicine, and completed his pediatric residency at the University of Alabama Children's Hospital. After serving in the United States Air Force for 4 years, Dr. Trumbull entered private pediatric practice in Montgomery, Alabama. He was a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics for 22 years until 2003, when he resigned to help found the American College of Pediatricians. He's written or helped write several position statements for the college, and his primary area of interest is behavioral pediatrics. He's written a wonderful new parenting book called Loving by Leading, A Parent's Guide to Raising Healthy and Responsible Children. He's practiced pediatrics for over 36 years, has been married to Nancy 34 years, and they have 5 adult children and 4 grandchildren. Den, welcome to Ask Dr. Walt.
Thank you, Walt. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for that fine introduction.
Well, I want to show you what a open man of God I am, because being a graduate of Harvard, well, Harvard on the Bayou, that's what we call LSU. And with your Florida background and your Alabama background, I suspect we have some areas that we don't agree.
Yeah, probably so.
Let's start with the definition. How would you define discipline?
Most people would think of the word discipline as correction. I discipline my child for doing wrong. But the better definition is training to produce character or a certain quality within a child or within a person. In my book, I talk about 4 basic components of discipline. Affirmation, instruction, correction, and then the parent-child relationship. These 4 components are necessary for discipline to work. So throughout my book, I prefer to refer to discipline as guidance for the child.
You know, I love those points, and let's just dive into each of those 4 points just for a second. So instruction, you say children can't know what is proper without instruction. I mean, it makes intuitive sense, but parents sometimes don't understand that, do they?
It does. Many times when I'm talking to parents and they are having difficulty with their child, particularly a toddler, we need to step back and say, have we truly informed this child? And is this child developmentally capable of understanding what we're requiring of them? So instruction has to come first.
So Dan, I was reading a parenting magazine recently, and it said this: corrective discipline is not necessary. Correction is old school. Modern day positive parenting says parents should exclusively persuade their children to behave with incentives, never frank correction. I thought, my goodness, that's the opposite of thing I've ever read in scripture, the opposite of anything I've read in science, and it doesn't make any intuitive sense. Am I off base? Am I missing modern positive parenting?
It's wishful thinking. That's what it is. It's wishful thinking. It's trying to create a gentler, more positive approach to parenting. But a positive approach to parenting is correcting children when they disobey. If we don't correct them, then it's incorrect, or what correct behavior is. So that may work with some very compliant children, but it will not work with all. There's no research evidence for that claim. There's no practical evidence for that claim. And then I would ask the founders or the creators of that method, what happens when it fails? What do you do next? I guess you give up and let the child take over. And sadly, Walt, that's what's happening today. More and more parents are so frustrated with the inappropriate and ineffective advice they're getting on the web or through social media. They're getting frustrated and just abdicating their role. They're just giving up, sadly. And children need parents' leadership.
Oh, I think that's a great point. Our first child, Kate, was the compliant, wonderful, amazing child. We weren't 2 years into her life before we wanted to call focus on the family, because Dr. Dobson needed to have Barb and I on the program because we had this parenting thing down just absolutely perfect. And then God gave us Scott. And we realized what you write in your book. I love this, Dan. You say, a child is not born pure, but innately self-focused. Scott taught us that, but explain what you mean.
Well, your experience, honestly, was my experience as well. With our first child, we had it down by 18 months. I started writing my parenting book. Then along came our second child. I put it on the shelf for 20 years. Yeah, any parent of a toddler knows that children are not born pure. But this goes back to the 1600s when a philosopher created this thought that children are born as blank slates, and their experience in the environment mold them over time. Now, there's no doubt that experience affects a child, and our parenting affects a child, but it doesn't. All parenting doesn't corrupt all children, but all children are born a bit corrupted. We know that from Scripture. They're sinners, and we call that in science self-focused and selfish. So that's a fact. And if you don't recognize that as the foundation of your parenting approach, then you're going to miss the mark. And that's what's happening. That is not the foundation for modern day parenting.
In fact, you write in the book, you say this: children actually want to be led, and they're more secure when they are. When parents require proper behavior, it is eventually acquired by the child. True?
Absolutely. Well, some of the most insecure children that I see in the office, they might be teenagers, but particularly school agers, are those who have been given too many choices and too much freedom. The parent thinks they're doing them a favor by following them, by considering they have wisdom above the parent's wisdom. But then sooner or later, the child realizes, I need some guidance. I need some guide rails on my bridge, as Dr. Dobson would say. And they become very insecure, and the results are miserable, sadly.
You write in the midst of your book about discipline and correction and instruction and affirmation that parents are responsible for setting their children up for success. How do we do that, and how do we derail that as parents?
Well, we set them up for success by first taking a look at their basic needs. And I've got a large section in my book on this, and this is where I start with parents. Do they have a sleep schedule? Did you do some sleep training when they were an infant? Infants are very ripe for sleep training. Do you have a set bedtime for them, whether they're a school age or a teenager? So sleep, number one. Number two, activity level. Tell me about screen time. I'll give them my handout. This is what I would recommend. Limit screen time so you make being inside more boring than being outside, which used to be the case many years ago. Now being inside is much more attractive. Thirdly, nutrition. Practice the family table from an early age. an 18-monther and up is capable of staying at the dinner table, being served the same foods everybody's served. And research has found that the family table really builds a child's self-esteem, their self-confidence, even their performance in the school can be affected by family meals. And then lastly, the marriage. You know, an insecure or a troubled marriage creates insecure children. They look to the parents' unity as their security. So if you want to start somewhere in working on your child's behavior, first take a look at your marriage. Seek counseling. None of us are perfect mates. Humbly go to a counselor and say, we need some help. Believe it or not, as your marriage improves, your child's behavior will improve. So that is what I call setting a child up for success.
Barb and I are directing a marriage ministry now at our church. We've had a couple hundred couples that have gone through that ministry over the last 5 years, and that's one of our foundations. We'll often have couples say, well, you know, I've got young kids. I really need to focus there first. And we'll say, no. You need to first focus on your relationship with God. That's number one. Number two, your relationship with each other, because the closer you each come to God, the closer you come to each other. But God has designed children to have a mother and a father. And for our single parents out there that are watching, I think Dr. Trumbull and I would agree there is not a more difficult job on earth than the one you have. But as a single parent, how do you find that opposite sex role model? If you're a single mom, how do you find the coach or the Sunday school teacher that can join you and give in kind of that male-female thing? That was a little quick bunny trail. But just to affirm that my experience and my understanding of Scripture is the same as yours, Dan, that strong marriage, that strong relationship with God filters into every part of our parenting.
It does. It really does. And so that's kind of foundational. And then you build upon that. Then you take a look at discipline, the components we've talked about. But I think you've got to first look at the foundation.
That's a great point. I want to hone in, and we've got just a few minutes left, but I want to hone in on the controversy of spanking. I want to publicly thank you and your co-authors, because when my partner and I in practice, we were at Kissimmee, John Hartman and I were looking at this issue of spanking, and what we saw in the literature was alarming to us. We read what you and your colleagues wrote, the articles that you cited, the testimony that you gave, and we realized the scientific support for what I call appropriate spanking. So let's get into that just for a few minutes. What's the debate on spanking?
Well, let's pull back and let's talk about corporal punishment. That's a common technical term used for spanking. And researchers, anti-spanking researchers, take corporal punishment, study it, and they find negative results. But that's because they don't tease out spanking from corporal punishment. Corporal punishment is physical punishment of any type: hitting, biting, slapping, any kind of abusive. We all would agree that's abusive physical punishment. But spanking is different. Spanking, parents know and children know what spanking is. They have not separated appropriate spanking from abusive forms of corporal punishment. And in so doing, they find harmful effects. It's really a movement more than anything else that does not have legs, but the AAP in particular sponsored a corporal punishment conference back in the mid-90s. I was privileged to be invited, and Dr. Diana Baumrein, the creator of authoritative parenting, was at that conference, and she and I and others were on a panel debating spanking versus non-spanking. The conclusion at the end of that conference was that spanking in and of itself is not harmful, but in the right context can be useful. 2 years later, the AAP took the inappropriate and inaccurate research that was cited at that meeting and came up with a very different conclusion, that all spanking should be discouraged. So it has to be looked at carefully, and it needs to be refined as far as research goes.
I want to go back to something you said, because I think this is critical for our viewers to understand, that virtually every anti-spanking advocate talks about corporal punishment, and they include in that punching a kid in the face, knocking a kid out, beating a kid with a rod, shocking a kid, whipping a kid. I mean, stuff that the average parent would never do or ever consider, but they call that spanking or punishment, say it's inappropriate. So let's define down to appropriate spanking. Let's define that. What would you say that is? And Dan, you write very well that that's not our only form of discipline. That's just one and maybe one of the last ones.
Yes, exactly. It's a tool in a parent's toolbox, used early on when children can't be reasoned with, as I was saying earlier. So you use it when milder measures have failed. For a younger child, that would be disapproval. It might be physical restraint, holding them in a parking lot in their hand so they don't run off. Timeout, which everyone knows about. And then you're left with nothing else, because privilege removal doesn't become effective till about 3.5 years of age. For the 2 to 3.5 year old, that's when spanking can be useful to back up the milder measures. So it can be phased in as early as 2 years of age and ideally phased out by 6 years of age. See, researchers who want harmful results from their research include all ages, including teenagers who are spanked and hit. That's inappropriate. So they not only do they not teach a parent how to use it and then study the results, but they include all ages. It should not be.
In general, we're talking children roughly 2, maybe 3, up to 5, maybe 6, not before, not after. As spanking itself, the actual act, at least for Barb and I, particularly with our stronger-willed child, Scott, it was the breach of a well-set boundary. It was a willful breach. I remember as a 2.5-year-old, he walked up to the TV. I was watching a football game, and he said, Dad, I'm going to turn it off. And I said, why? He said, because I don't want to watch football. I said, well, Dad, been planning this for a week, and he'd like to, and if you want to run out and play, that's fine. But he said, Dad, I'm turning it off. And I said, no, you don't want to do that. You just don't want to do that. There'll be a consequence if you do. And he looked at me just straight in the eye, reached over, and punched the TV. And so the breach of that consequence in that case ended up with a brief spank. He never turned that TV off again. So the breach of a consequence, but then how do you actually recommend administering a spanking? I mean, there are some experts that say a couple swats on the behind. There's a couple that say, I mean, Dr. Dobson almost famously said to use a wooden spoon or a ruler or something so that the child is disciplined by that, not by the parent's hand. How do you dissect that? What do you recommend to your parents, Jen?
Well, I tell them, first of all, it should not be impulsive. The child who's swatted on the leg in the grocery store because they're not acting right and they're inconveniencing the parent, that's not appropriate. That's impulsive uses. So it should be pre-planned. The child should be pre-warned. Johnny, when you do A and B, you're going to get a spanking because milder measures have failed. So now we're going to have to up the ante. When you do A or B, you're going to be spanked. So they have to be forewarned. It has to be done in private. I'm talking about 1 to 2 swats to the bottom, followed by an explanation and a hug and a reassurance that do not do that again or you'll get another spanking. When parents first start using spanking, many times misbehavior increases for the first week or 2 and most give up. But if you'll hang in there, the child's like, whoa, things have really changed here. I'm going to start complying, and it begins to work more and more. When milder measures such as timeout are backed up by spanking, then you use spanking less often and timeout becomes more effective. In other words, a 2-year-old should stay in the timeout chair for a full 2 minutes. And if they get out, you can correct that with a spanking, bring them back and start over again. And in time, you spank less and do timeout more because they respect the timeout as a punishment. So
that's such good advice. So it's always in private, and then always followed by love. We would always take Kate and Scott in arm, and I would always say, Kate, there's nothing you can do to make me love you more. There's nothing you can do to make me love you less. But I was disappointed when you chose to do that behavior. And I would prefer not to come back, but I want you to know I love you. And be a hug and usually be tears. And our experience goes along with the research that spanking became less and less and less. But I want to emphasize one thing that you say about the research that really stunned me, and that was that parents that don't spank actually have more risk of child abuse. Why is that?
Exasperation. They just get very frustrated. This can be a side effect of positive parenting. When a child fails multiple times to comply with the incentive, the child chooses to say, well, I don't really want a reward right now. I'm going to do what I want to do. And the parent's frustrated and in a moment of anger may be more physically abusive than you can imagine, spanking not being physically abusive. It can be a major problem. And when a parent, you might ask, who should not spank? Well, if a parent has a tendency toward impulsiveness, they need to step back and take a time out themselves. They should not spank. But it needs to always follow a procedure. So I recommend parents talk with one another. The interesting thing about marriage is opposites attract. And I see this time and time again. So when I'm talking to parents about discipline, one's like, I want to really start getting more firm. The other's, well, I don't want to be too firm. I tell them, discuss it, discuss the methods you're using, make sure you both agree, develop a plan, then move forward. So that also should be groundwork before one starts spanking a child if they have not been spanking them now.
That's absolutely something you should agree on. And if you don't agree, I tell them, talk with your pastor, talk with the youth leader, but let's settle this so that your child doesn't triangle you. Go back quickly to the ruler versus the hand. Do you have a preference? Does the research indicate one or the other?
There isn't good research either way, one way or the other. I actually do prefer Dr. Dobson's paddle approach because it formalizes it for the parent. It formalizes it for the child. You have to go get the instrument. The child knows when, where, how, and why they're spanked every time, and it's much more effective. But I have no problem with the hand on the buttocks. I have no problem with that either.
Yeah, and I would say it should never bruise. It should never injure. It's designed to correct the spirit, not affect the body. But when we moved from Bryson City, North Carolina to Kissimmee, I guess Scott was probably 5 or 6 at that time. Kate was 7 or 8. And the movers, when they moved our sofa in to the moving van, walked back, and the mover had 3 wooden spoons. He said, "We found this in the sofa," and I wonder how they got there. But Dan, our time's running out, but I want to finish with this. You write, within a healthy relationship, parents must invest time in the relationship, both with the marriage relationship and in the parenting relationship. I've told my parents in my practice this. I said, you can't schedule quality time. Quality time only occurs within quantity time, not in short spurts. How do you encourage your parents to do that?
I couldn't agree more. I've heard it said that children spell love, Time. There's no substitute for time. So while your children are young, step back, take the time, invest. Like any investment, the earlier you start investing, the greater the rewards are later on. So that may mean postponing recreational activities. It might mean postponing material aspirations. It might even mean postponing career opportunities while your children are young to gain more margin in your life to spend time with your child. Very, very important. There's no substitute for time. And in doing that, you're setting the child up again for success.
Well, Dan, speaking of time, we've run out of it. I want to thank you so much for giving us a biblical and scientific view of discipline, but we didn't even get into parenting style, which is important. Would you be willing to come back and we can do that in the future?
I'd be happy to. Sure would.
I look forward to it. Dr. Trumbull's latest book, Loving by Leading, is available at most online bookstores. In addition, you can read more about parenting highly healthy children in a couple of my books, God's Design for the Highly Healthy Child and God's Design for the Highly Healthy Teen. You can find them by just going to my website at drwalt.com and click on the Books tab. Also, if you have any concerns about your or your family's health that you'd like me to consider for future programs, just drop me an email at drwalt@liftable.tv. Now, one warning, I can't answer specific questions about your individual health, but I bet you have plenty of great general questions to ask me. So send them in and we'll get to as many as we can in future programs. So until our next visit, let's get moving together towards true health. And dear friend, I pray that you may enjoy good health and that all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting along well.